You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I might dispute that point because remember, Dunmore did not, although he dissolved the assembly, which pretty much he kind of had to do. I mean, he couldn't allow them to thumb their nose at the king. So he was in a tight spot, but he didn't try to prevent them. He could have barred them from entering Bruton Parish Church, where the service took place. He didn't. He could have put out a proclamation saying that people shouldn't go to church on that day. It was middle of the week, but he did none of these. In fact, he remained remarkably silent on the issue of the revolution, issues like tea and tariffs. He didn't talk about these well into 1775.
Hello, and welcome to episode 424 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In November 1775, as tensions between the British Empire and its rebellious colonies continued to escalate, Virginia's royal governor made a radical and to some terrifying proclamation. Quote, "I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard, or be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government. And I do hereby farther declare that all indented servants, Negroes, and others appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony, Virginia, to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity." End quote. To help raise men to fight against Virginia's revolutionaries, Lord Dunmore promised freedom to all of the revolutionaries' indentured servants and enslaved black men who would join his military force. Known to history as Dunmore's Proclamation, this single decree changed the course of the American Revolution in the South. It offered a lifeline to thousands of enslaved men, women, and their families, ignited fierce debates about loyalty and liberty, and revealed deep contradictions at the heart of a revolution that claimed to fight for freedom. As this week marks the 250th anniversary of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, we're marking the moment by taking a deeper look at the man behind it, John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, and at the revolution in Virginia, which Dunmore helped fuel. Our guide for this investigation is Andrew Lawler, an award-winning journalist and author of A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. Now, during our exploration, Andrew reveals who Lord Dunmore was and how his past shaped his leadership of colonial Virginia, the events that led to Dunmore's historic proclamation and the formation of his Ethiopian regiment, and the complicated history of a man long cast as a villain, but who may have played a pivotal role in reshaping the meaning of freedom in both British North America and the new United States. But first, have you ever wondered how historians actually uncover the past? How they find those hidden stories that change what we thought we knew? Inside the History Explorers Club, your curiosity becomes discovery. Each month, you'll step behind the scenes with expert historians, including some familiar voices from Ben Franklin's World, plus new voices you won't hear anywhere else. Together, we explore the detective work of history, how scholars piece together lies from letters, ledgers, and artifacts, and uncover the stories our textbooks overlook, the stories of everyday people, forgotten perspectives, and the moments that still shape us today. Now, membership will reopen in mid-January, but I'm planning a special pre-holiday sale for everyone on our waitlist. This will be your chance to join the club early for all of our end-of-year activities and at a discounted rate. So be sure you join the waitlist now at historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club, and be sure you sign up soon because that early access sale is coming very shortly. So be sure you join at historyexplorers.club. Okay, are you ready to explore the American Revolution in Virginia and Lord Dunmore's proclamation? Let's go meet our expert guide. Joining us is an award-winning journalist and a writer of history books. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, National Geographic, and Smithsonian. He's a contributing writer for science and a contributing editor for archaeology. He is the author of 4 books, including A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the crisis that spurred the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Andrew Lawler.
Thank you, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we're glad you're here, because we're about to explore an area of the Revolution that we haven't talked much about before. So your book, A Perfect Frenzy, explores the American Revolution in the Tidewater region of Virginia, specifically the area known as the Virginia Peninsula, which includes the modern-day cities and towns of Williamsburg, Newport News, Hampton, and Norfolk. Andrew, would you help us place the Virginia Peninsula on our mental maps of Virginia and tell us what drew you to study the American Revolution in this specific region of Virginia?
Well, Virginia, of course, at the time of the Revolution was the oldest colony, was founded in 1607. So Jamestown is right up the James River from what we call the Tidewater area, the area affected by the tides. And this is where the first English colonists put down firm roots. And by the time of the Revolution, Virginia was also the largest colony in British North America. It was the wealthiest colony and the most populous colony. My interest comes from my childhood. I was actually raised in Norfolk, Virginia, and I was raised with the idea that Lord Dunmore, who was the last royal governor appointed by King George, was a very wicked man indeed, who burned my hometown to the ground, who was an enemy of the good guys. That is, of course, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And, essentially he was a tyrant lover who the Patriots were happy to get rid of. That was the childhood tale that I was told, and I really believed that story until a few years ago when I stumbled on some alternative information.
It always strikes me as a bit funny or odd when that happens, because I grew up around Boston and the same thing happened to me. You hear a story about your local history, only later to discover that that story was a myth the whole time.
And the myth of my childhood was, as I mentioned, that Lord Dunmore had burned the city to the ground. And there was proof of that. My grandparents would take me to the local church. The only surviving structure was an old colonial church. And in the wall on the side of the church outside was a cannonball and even had a sign. It said, "Fired by Lord Dunmore, January 1st, 1776. I mean, to my mind, that was perfect evidence that the British had bombarded civilian cities that had no way to protect themselves. And this was a sign of just what kind of terrible things the British were doing. And therefore, of course, independence was the only route.
Well, let's focus on John Murray, the fourth Earl of Dunmore, and how the revolution unfolded through his eyes, so we can see the revolution a bit differently, especially as this year is the 250th anniversary of his famous proclamation. So, Andrew, would you tell us about John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, and what we know about his upbringing and experiences before the American Revolution?
So John Murray, who was the fourth Earl of Dunmore, as I mentioned, was the royal governor of Virginia when the revolution broke out. And he became really the first full-fledged villain among the British there in North America. But his background is fascinating. He's a Scottish aristocrat. He grew up in the Highlands. And his father actually participated in the rebellion of 1745 against King George II. This was the Jacobite uprising, which if you've seen the show Outlander, you'll be very familiar with it. There was an attempt to really overthrow these German kings and put a Jacobite, that is a James or a Charles, back on the throne. Now, Dunmore himself, John Murray at the time, before he got his title, he was a young teenager, and he actually went with his father and participated in this last great rebellion against a British king. Now, the rebellion failed, but they came very, very close to taking London and driving King George II out of town. Dunmore's father was convicted of treason and only barely escaped execution. So his son was always living under this cloud of being the son of a traitor. And he found it very difficult to make his way in the world. He finally got a minor position in the British Army, did a little fighting in France. And then when King George III came to the throne, the new monarch really wanted to kind of make good with these Scottish nobles who had periodically tried to upset the realm. So he was made a member of the House of Lords once he'd become an earl. And at that point, he needed money because to be an earl was an expensive business. You had to have a townhouse in London. He had a house in Edinburgh. He had a country place. And of course, you had to have fine clothes and you had to entertain. So this was way beyond the means of a fairly poor Scottish aristocrat. Fortunately, his wife's sister married a well-placed British minister, and thereby Dunmore was able to get a paying job. And the job, which was common among Scottish aristocrats who were kind of down at the heels, was to go to North America and govern a colony. And his first job was to be governor of New York. So he arrived in New York in 1770, but then the governor of Virginia died suddenly, and less than a year later, the king sent him to Virginia. And that's really where our story begins.
You know, most governors who received commissions to serve as the governor of Virginia were really excited about it because Virginia was the wealthiest colony in British North America, so therefore the colony where governors could make the most money. But I was surprised when I read your book, Andrew, A Perfect Frenzy, that Dunmore was not at all excited and actually tried to get out of his commission to serve as governor of Virginia. So why was Dunmore upset about this new, very lucrative post?
Well, Dunmore might have needed a good salary, but he wasn't interested in going to Virginia, even though it paid better than New York. New York being a kind of middling colony, and Virginia being a larger one that paid better. Dunmore liked Manhattan. He liked New York. He liked the social scene. He was something of an intellectual. He had scientific instruments, a large library, musical instruments, and he was known as a really gregarious guy who liked to party. So Virginia seemed like a terrible place to go. Why? Because he feared that he would die of some terrible fever, and more importantly, he would be bored to death in this really rural colony. Remember that Virginia was unlike any other colony in that it was very rural. There was only one city in the entire colony. That was Norfolk, the port on the coast that you mentioned earlier. Williamsburg, which was the capital, had only a couple of thousand people. So Dunmore knew that he was going to a place where most people lived on these scattered plantations where a white family owned enslaved Africans who cultivated tobacco. The wealth of Virginia was based on tobacco. So when Dunmore finally reluctantly had to be told by the king to get your butt to Virginia, and he arrived really not very popular among Virginians because they knew perfectly well that he had tried to get out of this appointment.
You made that point in your book, too. In A Perfect Frenzy, you note that Dunmore's reluctance to leave New York also seemed to be due to his education. He was a man of the Scottish Enlightenment, and in New York City, there were other figures like him who were part of this movement, men like Cadwallader Colden. And this was at a time when New York was far from the largest city in North America. It was much smaller in the 1770s, but it did still have this intellectual cosmopolitanism that allowed Dunmore to attend events like intellectual salons, while, as you said, Virginia really was just much more rural and a less cosmopolitan place.
Yes, indeed. And this is a really interesting background to Dunmore, that he was in the thick of the Scottish Enlightenment back in Edinburgh. Now, this was a really important time. Even Voltaire said, nothing really creative comes out of any place but Scotland these days. So Dunmore was in the middle of that in the 1750s and 60s, and he knew Adam Smith, he knew Ferguson, he knew all of these, really important thinkers. He dined with David Hume. I mean, he really was connected in with these people. So there was this curious intellectual side of Dunmore, which we really haven't heard much about because he was later painted by the Patriots as a bit of a buffoon, which certainly is not the case.
Now, Dunmore arrived in Virginia in 1771. What did Dunmore make of Virginia and its capital, Williamsburg? And what did the people of Williamsburg and Virginia make of Lord Dunmore?
Well, at first, the Virginia gentry, these are the tobacco planters that basically control the politics of the colony, were skeptical of this person. Number one, he hadn't wanted to come in the first place. Number two, he was a Scot. And there was a good deal of prejudice towards Scots in those days, particularly Highland Scots like Dunmore. They remembered the rebellion of 1745 and the Virginia gentry, who prided themselves, mostly these were English-descended gentry, they prided themselves on their loyalty to the king. So they looked with trepidation at the arrival of this Scottish aristocrat who had a rather checkered past, who hadn't wanted to come to Virginia, and who, might be a little, let's say, far removed from the interests of the Virginia gentry. But they were proved quickly wrong.
It's interesting that people question Dunmore's loyalty. You mentioned the Outlander series earlier, and we tend to get this idea that the Scots who participated in the Jacobite Rebellion moved to British North America and then became staunch revolutionaries because they were once rebels against the English crown and knew how to fight the English crown. And this is something we see in the Outlander series, and yet when we really look at the numbers and read other scholars' work, it was really quite the opposite. Many Scots, especially those who came to North America after the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745, were more like Lord Dunmore. They stayed loyal to the crown and fought as loyalists.
Yes, it's one of these mysteries of the American Revolution that you have these Scots, many of whom participated in that 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, who then, when confronted with a rebellion against King George II's son, King George III, they choose mostly to side with the British. Why did they choose to stay loyal to the king? I think it depends on the individual, of course, but I think there are several reasons. I think the Scots understood what could happen if a rebellion goes wrong. The Scots had suffered hugely as a result of the 1745 rebellion. It was illegal to wear Scottish dress. The language was suppressed. The culture was suppressed. It really was a terrible, terrible time for many Scots who already were pretty poor. So the devastation caused by the rebellion, I think, made people who lived in America have second thoughts. They understood the price they might have to pay. Now, also, there's the fact that most of them had taken oaths to defend and be loyal to King George III, who had actually gone out of his way to try and include the Scots, like Lord Dunmore, in the House of Lords and to give them a little more political power. In fact, there were many people in England who believed that King George III favored the Scots and gave them too much power. So even in the colonies, there was a good deal of concern that these Scots were running the British government. So when Dunmore arrived, he and other Scots, I think, did have a strong attachment to the king that was very difficult to shake.
Well, speaking of changing minds, you note in A Perfect Frenzy that Dunmore knew that people in Virginia were skeptical of him and that he worked to become friendly with several elite Virginians and really took pains to get to know them on a personal level, which in turn helped change these Virginians' minds about Lord Dunmore. One of the elite Virginians that Dunmore took the time to know and really form a friendship with was George Washington. Lord Dunmore and George Washington are not normally two people we put together as friends, so I wonder if you would tell us more about the friendship of these two men.
Well, you would certainly never know by what George Washington said later about Lord Dunmore that these two men were best of friends. From 1771, when Dunmore arrived in Virginia, until 1775, these guys spent a lot of time together. They both enjoyed the theater. They both enjoyed horses and riding and hunting. They enjoyed outdoor pursuits. And they also, most of all, enjoyed the idea of getting really rich. And the way to get rich in those days was to get land. So both Dunmore and Washington shared this desire to obtain enormous tracts of land. Now, why land? Keep in mind that in Virginia, with the tobacco culture, tobacco would just suck the nutrients out of soil. So after a few years, your fields no longer were productive. You needed to get new land. So there was this great push to get land on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains in the Ohio Valley, a very, very fertile area that, of course, was the home to many indigenous people. And this was something that both Dunmore and Washington shared a great desire for. But there was a problem. The problem, of course, was that King George III, in the wake of the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, had said no white colonists can legally own land on the other side of the mountains. We want the indigenous people to stay in the west, the white people in the east, and that way you won't get into some expensive war that I'll have to pay for. Now, in 1763, when King George announced this proclamation line, a lot of Virginians felt like, well, eventually the British will give in and they'll let us move west. But in fact, they really stuck to this policy. So Washington hoped that by cultivating his friendship with Dunmore, he could convince Dunmore to convince the king to back off and allow people like Washington to begin speculating in land in the West. And this really was a major bond between these two men.
This relationship also offers us a very different picture of Washington, right? In our histories, Washington's the leader. He's the man with power. And yet, as we read A Perfect Frenzy, we get the sense that it wasn't always that way, that sometimes George Washington was the supplicant because he didn't always have political power. And in this instance, we can see that Washington really had to negotiate this land deal by getting Lord Dunmore involved, by getting him to support this idea so that Washington could create and have these large land tracts and Western lands that would in some ways become the basis of his later day wealth.
Well, the two of these men were alike in so many ways. I mean, the one was kind of short and stout. That would be Dunmore, and Washington, of course, being kind of tall and thin and muscular. They were really kind of an odd couple, but they shared several things. Number one, they both had lost a father, Dunmore to house arrest, and then Washington when his father died young. They both were poor relative to their class. So Washington grew up in poverty compared to other gentry. And the same was true for Dunmore. So I think they both really wanted to get ahead in the world. They felt like they had been held back. They felt like they suffered discrimination in a sense, that it was hard for them to move forward. And they understood that to do that, they needed wealth, and that meant land. So this is just something they had in common that I think we tend to forget. Washington was a very ambitious man. He really wanted to become wealthy. He wanted to become a very large landowner. He didn't have any thoughts, I think, beyond that. It really was about moving up in his class, becoming a leading person among the Virginia gentry, which meant having a fine coach. It meant having good clothes. It meant being sure that Martha, who loved very nice clothes, had the latest fashions. This was the way you presented yourself. And Dunmore was very similar in the way he liked to live his life. So both these men were really wedded to luxury, not so much because they loved luxury itself, but it was a way to present yourself as somebody who has made it in the world. And they both desperately wanted to be accepted by the wider, wealthier world.
Now, Lord Dunmore is famous for two events. His November 1775 proclamation that freed the revolutionaries and enslaved people, Dunmore's Proclamation, and the 1774 frontier war that bears his name. Andrew, would you tell us about Dunmore's War or the Shawnee-Dunmore War? What did this war mean for Dunmore's reputation and for the colony of Virginia?
Many of your listeners may never have heard of Dunmore's War, and that's in part, of course, because it occurred right before the American Revolution, so it tends to be overshadowed. But it was extremely important for Virginians like Washington. As I mentioned, there was this great desire among Virginia planters to expand and to move west to get land. But of course, there were two things that stood in the way. One was King George III, and the other were the indigenous people who actually lived in this land. And because of tensions between white settlers who had moved illegally, or squatting on land west of the mountains, they came into conflict with the local indigenous peoples, particularly the Shawnee tribe, and there was trouble. And this was an opportunity for the planters, led by Lord Dunmore, to teach the indigenous people a lesson, and more than that, to actually use it as an excuse to take their land. And Dunmore was able to do this with the full support of the Virginia gentry, including George Washington. He marched west. He gathered up an army mostly of small farmers and hunters, several thousand men, and led them across the mountains, and was able, with several of his lieutenants, to defeat the Shawnee and sign a peace treaty that essentially doubled the size of Virginia. Now, this is exactly what the Virginia planters, and not just Washington, but Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and many other Virginia planters were land speculators. This gave them exactly what they wanted, which was control over this land to the west. Now, of course, the king was furious when he heard about Dunmore's War and about the treaty with the Shawnees, because it went against British policy. By then, of course, the revolution was already starting, and that conflict became kind of lost in the wider struggle.
It certainly read like Dunmore's War endeared him to Virginians, but it also made the king question his loyalty.
Yes, and I think historians haven't asked this question, but I did in the book, and that is, did Dunmore actually consider siding with the Patriots, siding with his friends like George Washington? Plus, remember, he had plantations that he had bought, he had enslaved people that he had purchased. He had become one of the gentry. He was at the apex of this gentry society. Not only that, in 1774, he brought his wife and children, his 7 children, over to Williamsburg, which was a pretty radical move to bring your entire family over. Clearly, he was intending to stay for a while. He had put all his wealth into Virginia, and one has to ask whether he considered throwing in his lot with these incipient rebels.
Yeah, Dunmore certainly had a lot to lose and to consider when choosing a side during the imperial crisis.
And he ended up, of course, losing quite a bit.
Now, as Andrew mentioned, in May 1774, the American Revolution gained momentum in Virginia. The Virginia House of Burgesses, the oldest legislative body in British North America, passed a resolution calling for June 1, 1774, to be a day of fasting and prayer in a show of support for Boston, which was undergoing punishment for the Boston Tea Party through the Coercive Act. So think the Boston Port Bill, the Port of Boston was shut down. Andrew, what were Dunmore's views on the American Revolution and its protests by 1774? And what did Dunmore make of the Burgesses' bold call for a public display of support for Boston?
Well, Dunmore was well versed in British law. Of course, he'd been a legislator serving in the House of Lords, and he understood what was at stake. It sounds so simple and so inoffensive. Who could argue with a day of fasting and prayer in support of people who were facing a boycott and potential starvation? But you have to remember that under British tradition, only the king could declare a day of fasting and prayer. So when Thomas Jefferson and a group of other patriots got together and cooked up this plan, I think cooked up was Jefferson's phrase, and they got a very well-known, rather pious legislator to propose it, nobody argued with this because they thought, well, it seems pretty inoffensive. But Dunmore knew that only the king could make such a day legal. And he realized that this was a subtle way for the patriots to essentially go outside of the British tradition. And kind of in a way, they were thumbing their nose at the king. So Dunmore did what other governors had done previously, and that is he dissolved the assembly. Basically said, okay, guys, go home. We're going to have new elections, and hopefully when you come back, you will have come to your senses.
From reading A Perfect Frenzy, it also seemed like the day of fasting and prayer may have been a tipping point for Dunmore. You posed the question that you raised earlier, which is, did Dunmore ever think of joining the revolution? And it seemed like before the day of fasting and prayer, Dunmore was vacillating on whether to support the revolution. But that after the call for the day of fasting and prayer, it seemed like he had decided, no, I'm going to remain loyal to the king. And then he held fast to that position.
I might dispute that point because remember, Dunmore did not, although he dissolved the assembly, which pretty much he kind of had to do. I mean, he couldn't allow them to thumb their nose at the king. So he was in a tight spot, but he didn't try to prevent them. He could have barred them from entering Bruton Parish Church, where the service took place. He didn't. He could have put out a proclamation saying that people shouldn't go to church on that day. It was middle of the week. But he did none of these. In fact, he remained remarkably silent on the issue of the revolution, issues like tea and tariffs. He didn't talk about these well into 1775. I think Dunmore understood that he was in a very weak position. He had very few soldiers, very few ships. They were, of course, all in Boston. And also, I think he thought it might blow over. He thought that there was going to be a resolution. And we have to remember that as late as early 1776, many Americans believed that the British were going to back down and give in to their demands. So I think Dunmore played it very cool and made no public statements that really went against the Patriots until that fateful march in 1775, when Patrick Henry kind of threw down the gauntlet and they created a militia outside of British control. And that was the real tipping point where Dunmore had to choose, do I side with the Patriots or do I tell them they've gone too far?
Now, like Massachusetts and New England, Virginia began preparing for armed conflict with the British Empire in 1774-1775. Andrew, would you tell us about the Williamsburg gunpowder plot and how this incident led to a hardening line in Virginia?
Of course, we know a lot about Lexington and Concord, but we forget that 48 hours later, there was this very, very important and largely forgotten incident, unless you go to Williamsburg, that happened, which really, I think, lit the fire that created the revolution in the American South. So let's back up. I mentioned Patrick Henry. So in March of 1775, Patrick Henry and other Patriot leaders in Virginia, who consisted primarily of white planters who owned enslaved people, they met and they created this militia spurred by Patrick Henry. And that was really the point that Dunmore could no longer stay silent, because the king had said, I don't want these people meeting. You've got to stop this. He'd sent this message out to all the governors. So Dunmore, at that point, I think, made this fateful decision to oppose the Patriots. And the way he did this was the following month to secretly spirit out some of the gunpowder that was contained in the arsenal in the middle of Williamsburg, not far from the palace where he lived. When he did this, it was discovered, but it was too late. The Marines that got the powder managed to get it on a British ship in the James River, a few miles away, and there was outrage. In fact, there was a mob that descended on the palace and was threatening him. But this was not Boston. Your friends in Boston there, if somebody did something like that, oh my God, they would have torn the house down. They literally took homes apart of British officials back in the day. But Virginia was different. Williamsburg was a small town. There really weren't mobs. There were tavern keepers. Half the people were enslaved, and they weren't about to cause trouble because they knew what the consequences would be. So, in fact, a delegation knocked on Dunmore's door and politely said, excuse me, we're missing some gunpowder, and why did you take it? And the governor said, well, there was going to be a slave uprising. There was talk of that, so I was putting the powder in a safe place. Now, obviously, this was a see-through excuse, but the Patriots bought it. And they actually said, okay, and they went home, and that was kind of the end of things. It was a day later that everything changed, and that is when Dunmore apparently got news that he was going to be threatened. Now, remember, he's in a palace with his children and his wife, very few soldiers. He's very exposed, and there are lots of Patriots running around town. So he mentioned to a doctor who was paying a call to a member of the palace staff that if anybody tried to commit any kind of violence against him or his officers, that he would free the slaves. And this was an astounding thing for a Virginia governor to say.
It did seem like right after the gunpowder incident, the political situation in Virginia became much more volatile. So do you think that Dunmore's threat to free enslaved people was the moment that Virginia became much more outwardly or publicly revolutionary?
I think so. I think if he had not made that threat, that the gunpowder incident might have faded away. It might not have been such a big deal. But the fact that he made this statement, and it's hard for us to grasp just how radical this statement was. Remember that 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved. And actually, at the time, there had been no census. The belief was among whites that there were actually more black people than there were white people. So there was this constant fear that enslaved people would slit your throat at night, would poison you when they served you breakfast, or would even just run away and you would lose this enormous investment. So white Virginians, and many of them owned maybe 1 or 2 enslaved people. There are very few that owned more than a dozen. So slavery was a very widespread practice in Virginia at the time. And I think there was this constant anxiety among Virginians who were white that there would be an insurrection. And here you have the Virginia governor. One of his primary jobs, if not his most primary job, is to ensure the safety of white residents. Here he is suggesting that he himself is going to call for a slave uprising. And this news traveled up and down the East Coast. It was printed in newspapers everywhere, and it infuriated the Patriots. It also provided great hope for all of those hundreds of thousands of people who were held in bondage.
So how do we move from April 22, April 23, 1775, when Dunmore made his threat to free enslaved people, to Dunmore evacuating his family for a naval vessel off the coast of Yorktown in mid-May? Actually, this is a perfect place for a cliffhanger, so let's hold on to that thought and thank our episode sponsors. Have you ever wondered what life was like in early America beyond the dates and battles? At Ben Franklin's World, we dig into the details that textbooks skip. The voices of women, indigenous peoples, enslaved people, immigrants, and ordinary men and women who shaped their world and ours. Each week, You hear from leading historians who bring new research and trustworthy insight so you can explore the past with confidence, not confusion. But this independent work only happens because of listeners like you. Listeners like Sue D., Christina F., Donald G., Patricia H., and Virginia H. make these conversations possible. You help keep our show independent and our episodes free for everyone to enjoy and learn from. So thank you for your generosity, and thank you for supporting my work. Ben Franklin's World is produced by Clio Digital Media, a small nonprofit supported entirely by our community. People like you who believe that history should be accurate, inclusive, and alive. Every gift, whether it's $5 or $100, helps us keep these conversations free and accessible to everyone who wants to understand where we've come from and why it matters today. And because Clio Digital Media is a 501c3 nonprofit, your gift is fully tax deductible. So if you value this kind of important everyday history, please support us at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And thank you for helping us keep history honest, human, and accessible to all. Andrew, how do we move from around April 22, April 23, 1775, when Dunmore made his threat to free enslaved people, to Dunmore's evacuation of his family to a naval vessel in mid-May? How did the situation in Virginia, especially in Williamsburg, deteriorate from Dunmore's perspective?
It's a very interesting period between April and June of 1775, because you would think because of this incident, because of his threat, that things would really have gone south, so to speak. But in fact, actually things calmed down quite a bit. Dunmore did not make that threat again. Basically, Dunmore's threat to free the slaves forced the Patriots to stand down from two separate attempts to attack and take over Williamsburg. And instead, the House of Burgesses reconvened at the end of May in 1775, and they all came back. Peyton Randolph, who was the president of the Continental Congress, left Philadelphia to come. He was the Speaker of the House to oversee this new session of the House of Burgesses. It was really remarkable. It was almost as if there was no revolution happening. And this is after Lexington and Concord. This is right before Bunker Hill. In New England, things are really going nuts. But in Virginia, you still have the gentry sitting down with Dunmore, trying to work things out. It's a really remarkable fact that the Virginia gentry clearly did not want or really think much about independence, except for a few hotheads like perhaps Thomas Jefferson.
Now, after Dunmore evacuated his family, he also ends up on a naval vessel and forms what comes to be called as Dunmore's fleet off the coast of Norfolk. What made Dunmore evacuate Williamsburg in June, given that tensions had settled down?
Well, while the House of Burgesses was meeting in June of 1775, there were a couple of incidents that I'm sure made Dunmore nervous. The arsenal that we mentioned was broken into by patriots a couple of times. Basically, public opinion began to turn against him. And at some point, we don't know the details, but I do have some good, I think, informed speculation in my book. We do know that Dunmore faced a plot. The Patriots intended either to kidnap or even to kill Dunmore. And when he got news of this, he immediately packed his family up. They got on a ship in Yorktown, a dozen or so miles away, and Dunmore remained there until the end of June. In the meantime, the House of Burgesses, remarkably, kept negotiating with Dunmore. They kept saying, well, yes, please come back. They didn't say good riddance to you. In fact, they really wanted to keep the king's representative, and they insisted that he was safe, but Dunmore was having none of it. He believed that he was in danger, and he was probably correct. In the end, the House of Burgesses and Dunmore could not agree on even a place to meet to settle their differences. So finally, the House of Burgesses decided to adjourn, and that was kind of the end of this old assembly, the oldest assembly, as you mentioned, in North America. And Dunmore then took off for Norfolk, Virginia. This was the port city in the southeastern part of the state that was, a very large and thriving port at that point. So you have Dunmore deciding he's going to create a base of operations from which to combat the rebels from the southeastern city, and the rebels have taken over Williamsburg.
It's quite remarkable when you think about Virginia, the land of Richard Henry Lee's famous 1776 resolution for the colonies to declare their independence from Great Britain, form foreign alliances, and draft Articles of Confederation, a land of seemingly gung-ho revolutionaries actually trying to negotiate with the governor and maybe toe a more moderate line even late into 1775.
Well, the Virginia Patriots were talking a good line in Philadelphia, but we tend to remember people like Jefferson and Patrick Henry, and we tend to forget that there were people like Peyton Randolph, who was actually very much a moderate, and that George Washington himself was quite the moderate, and others on the Virginia delegation. So it's hard looking back at history to really see things as they were at the time, but independence was not an idea that was widely accepted among Virginia's patriot leaders, and many of them were terrified at the prospect of going to war with the British Empire. Plus, Virginians were woefully unprepared. They did not have a single ship, not even a boat. They had very few trained soldiers. They were scattered over a very large area. There was only this one city where you could concentrate your forces, but that's where Dunmore was. So the Patriots also lacked an army because Virginians never liked paying taxes then or now. And so there was no standing army. So unlike in New England, where you had these companies of men who've been training for, in some cases, for years, Virginia did not have anything similar. What they did have, though, was a lot of militia who had fought in Dunmore's war. And many of those people, though, were far to the west and largely, at that point, not terribly concerned about what they viewed as a fight between the Virginia elites and the British elites.
Now, you mentioned that by June 1775, Dunmore and his family had retreated to the ocean. They were sitting off the coast of Norfolk. What led Dunmore on November 7, 1775, to issue his famed proclamation freeing the enslaved people who belonged to revolutionary slaveholders?
Well, I think one of the most poignant moments of the American Revolution in Virginia is that point where Dunmore is alone. He sends his family back to England. He has virtually no troops. He has a couple of ships, but one of them was withdrawn and sent back up the coast. So he has virtually no forces. It makes no sense that he would stay and fight. But I think what happened was he remembered the battles of 1745. He remembered Bonnie Prince Charlie taking on King George II. And that event happened almost precisely to the day, 20 years previously. So I think there's a moment in July of 1775 where Dunmore realizes that he can do what Bonnie Prince Charlie almost did. He can raise an army of people who are disaffected with a king. And that in 1745 meant a lot of Scots, a lot of English. There were French there. There were even some French Africans who were actually part of his army. So it was a multiracial army, multi-ethnic army that Bonnie Prince Charlie pulled together. And I think that Dunmore saw an opportunity to do this. And I think the main reason he did was not because of anything Dunmore did, but because of what the enslaved Africans did. As soon as he went to Yorktown, enslaved people began to leave their plantations. Now remember, to do this was a crime. You could be tortured, you could be imprisoned if you left your plantation without permission. But nevertheless, large numbers of Black Americans began to desert and began to show up on these British ships, these Royal Navy ships at Yorktown and then later Norfolk, asking for sanctuary, asking for help, asking for freedom in exchange for fighting against their former owners. This is what really triggered the events that took place in Virginia. And we know that the first battle south of Massachusetts took place in Hampton, Virginia. And why? Hampton is just across the river from Norfolk. It took place because the Patriots were demanding that the British return an escaped enslaved man who was serving as a pilot for the British. He knew the waters. He was a very valuable person. The Patriots wanted him back, and the British said, no way. He wants to stay with us. And this is what triggered the first bloodshed south of Massachusetts. It really is what started the war in the South, this conflict over what the Patriots viewed as private property that the British were seizing, were taking private property. And this infuriated the Patriots, most of whom were slave owners at that point. And this is what led to violence beginning to spiral out of control.
That's pretty remarkable because Dunmore didn't issue his official proclamation until November, and yet enslaved people had really started to flock to him as early as June. As you were researching, Andrew, were you able to get a sense of why enslaved people started flocking to Dunmore's side as early as June 1775? Was it because he had made that earlier threat to free enslaved people in Virginia? What indication did Dunmore give that he might be willing to act on his words and grant self-emancipated Black people sanctuary?
The enslaved people of Virginia had a very, very impressive intelligence network. And certainly word that Dunmore had promised or had threatened, the Patriot view, had threatened to free the slaves if they didn't back down, was information that was transmitted all across the colony. So Black people, they knew what was going on. They understood that the governor had made this kind of vague promise to free enslaved people, and they saw an opportunity. I think what this shows is that those who were enslaved had a very, very strong desire to be free. They were willing to risk torture and imprisonment in order to show up behind British lines without any guarantee that Dunmore would help them. What's important here is that I think the numbers that flocked, and we don't have precise numbers, but we know there were hundreds. And when I looked at the records of the people who didn't make it, they were captured by the Patriots. The jails were full of people who were trying to get to Dunmore. So you think of those that actually made it to Dunmore. So I think in a way, it was these enslaved people who kind of forced Dunmore's hand. They were showing up in large numbers saying, we are willing to fight for you. And I think that's what made Dunmore stay and think that he could actually build an army around enslaved Africans, Scottish merchants, and other disaffected people that could take on the Patriots. So when he makes this Emancipation Proclamation on November 15th, 1775, he waits until he has a victory at a place called Kemp's Landing, where the Patriots ambushed a group of his soldiers, including Africans who had weapons, and they won. In fact, the militia commander, the Patriot militia commander, was captured by his former enslaved person. And this really impressed Dunmore. He knew tough Highlanders, and I think he saw in these Black men really good fighters who would be loyal and who had real motivation to fight against the Patriots. And that's what led him to put out this Emancipation Proclamation.
Travis would like to know more about what the impact of Dunmore's proclamation was on Virginia and Great Britain. So could you tell us how the proclamation was received by Virginians and the British military?
Word of the Emancipation Proclamation quickly spread up and down the East Coast. This was reported in newspapers everywhere, and then eventually in Britain itself. Now, the Patriots, not surprisingly, were outraged. I mean, people in Philadelphia and in Boston. In fact, George Washington famously said that if we don't crush Lord Dunmore soon, it'll be like a snowball. It's just going to gain strength as Black people flock to his cause. And interestingly, when Washington got news of Dunmore's proclamation, which basically said, if you are owned by a patriot and you come to me, I will free you and give you a gun. Washington reversed himself. Washington had not wanted to have Black men in the Continental Army. He had refused to allow them to reenlist. And within days of him getting news of Dunmore's proclamation, he reversed himself. And pretty soon, the Continental Army had lots of Black people in it. In fact, it was the most integrated force in American history until the Korean War. So, there's one example of a large impact that the proclamation had. Now, and of course, Dunmore went on to create the Ethiopian Regiment. He put together a whole regiment of Black men with uniforms and with guns, with training. First time this had ever been done in the British Empire. There was a Black regiment. And this was absolutely terrifying to the Patriots because they knew they were in a very weak position with so many people who had so many reasons to side with the British.
Now, historians like to remind us that even though Dunmore said he would free the enslaved men who ran away from their revolutionary enslavers, a lot of enslaved people also ran away from their loyalist slaveholders. What did Dunmore do when he received these enslaved people who ran away from loyalists?
Well, we don't actually have good numbers to say what he did. What we do know is that when enslaved people who were owned by patriots arrived, that they were immediately emancipated and mustered into the army. And we also know that he accepted the families of these men as well. even though the proclamation specifically was only for those who could fight, he allowed the families to come along. This is a very important detail. He wasn't just looking for an army. He was willing to take in anybody he could. Now, those who were enslaved by loyalists, there certainly were some who may have been sent back to their owners, but remember, their owners at that point were running scared because of the Patriots. So it's really not clear whether Dunmore sent many of them back to work on the plantation because a lot of loyalists were fleeing themselves. They had become refugees. I think your allusion is a little bit to the morality of what Dunmore is doing. Many people have been critical of him, saying, oh, he was just trying to get cannon fodder. He didn't really intend to provide freedom for these people. And I think that that's really bogus. We don't know what Dunmore was thinking, but we do know that he did free people. And we do know that he continued to free people. And even as late as after the war, he continued to argue that people who were enslaved, who had fought for the British, should receive compensation. This was not a short-term, simple attempt to combat the rebels. I think he saw this as something more. And I think he evolved as a person. I think he began by being just another slave owner, but then over time saw that these men and women and children were quite brave and that they actually were worthy of respect. And just the term Ethiopian regiment, by the way, Ethiopia being one of those rare terms of respect accorded to Africans by Europeans, says it all. And in fact, the full name of the regiment, Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, he put his name on it. So I think that he really saw the need not just to create an army, but to create a existential threat, if you will, against the Patriots and the social hierarchy that they had created.
Speaking of the Ethiopian Regiment, Jonathan wonders if you could tell us about this regiment and how Black life in the British Army was similar to and different from the lives led by white soldiers in the British Army.
The Royal Navy had a very long tradition of using Black sailors. That goes back a long way, and there were certainly a lot of Black crew members on the Royal Navy ships at the time. Now, the British Army was different. They did not have that same tradition. And so the white soldiers, the white redcoats who were there in Virginia, didn't really want to fight with these Black men. And I think that's the reason why Dunmore put them in a separate regiment and gave them Virginia officers to oversee them, as well as British. So the regiment was set up much like any British regiment at the time. We don't have precise numbers, but at least 300 to 400 men initially. We know that they kept coming in large numbers. We know that disease wiped out many, but that more people kept coming. So the news got out, and people as far away as Massachusetts were fleeing south in order to get behind British lines and to achieve freedom. So the Ethiopian Regiment, while it didn't last that long, it lasted from November of 1775 until they were driven out of Virginia in August of 1776. During this period, they posed a really, really potent threat to the Virginia Patriots, who were unbelievably poorly organized, incapable of really pulling together. They were constantly fighting amongst themselves. Patrick Henry was at odds with Pendleton, who was the head of the Patriot movement in Virginia. And the Patriots were really quite bumblers at the time. And the Ethiopian Regiment, by contrast, even though these were people who had never had much chance to carry a gun, were proving themselves to be quite effective.
You mentioned that people have questioned Dunmore's long-term plans about making people free. And Colin and Lydia have heard that Dunmore actually abandoned his Black allies after the war. So would you tell us the truth of it? What happened to the members of Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment and their families after the war?
So in August of 1776, after several ill-fated attempts to oust Dunmore and his Ethiopian Regiment from Virginia, the Patriots finally succeeded. They attacked him at a place called Gwynn's Island, forcing the fleet, which by then consisted of some 3,000 civilians, as well as members of the regiment, as well as a white regiment that he had created, and the Redcoats, plus the Royal Navy ships. So this huge flotilla sailed away. Now, interestingly, Dunmore could have dumped these people, the Ethiopian Regiment members and their families. He could have just dumped them and left them. He did not. As far as we know, he took every single person he could, and he took them to New York, while others went to different places, such as Florida. Some went to Britain. Dunmore took the Ethiopian regiment members and their families directly to New York, where they participated in the Battle of Long Island that took place not long after, when the British invasion force arrived to drive Washington out of New York. And then the Ethiopian regiment members were absorbed into the British Army as part of what was called the Black Pioneers, and they remained a really key part of the British effort. Now, Dunmore's proclamation was then copied by several British generals, such as General Clinton, and this tradition of freeing Black people so they would fight for the British really extended throughout the war. Dunmore never, as far as I know, abandoned anybody. He took his people with him. He encouraged the king when he got back to England to free the slaves and offer them freedom in exchange for the fight. He really understood that the only way the British were probably going to be able to overcome the rebel opposition was by unleashing the power of these liberty-loving enslaved people on the Patriots.
Andrew, how much do you think Dunmore's proclamation has contributed to John Murray's legacy and the way we remember him?
I don't think Dunmore had any notion of what impact his proclamation would have. He was doing it as a short-term way to create an army when he had Patriot Army marching his way. But the ripple effects are enormous. I already mentioned that Washington, as a result, allowed Black men to serve in the Continental Army. That had a huge impact by creating an army of veterans in the end who insisted on having full rights. I think Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is a direct descendant of Dunmore's proclamation. His decree is really similar to that made by Lincoln. So I think that although Dunmore certainly didn't have it in mind, the result of his proclamation, and we should say a proclamation that was spurred by the enslaved Africans who were willing to risk torture and imprisonment in order to gain their freedom, really has made a huge impact on American history. And I would argue that without Dunmore's proclamation, it's very hard to see how the Civil War might have ended the way it did.
Well, we have just scratched the surface of a larger story that Andrew recounts about the American Revolution on the Virginia Peninsula in his book, A Perfect Frenzy. His book also provides an excellent and comprehensive account of the Battle of Great Bridge, the burning of Norfolk, and how these events contributed to the American Revolution and to Lord Dunmore's legacy and reputation. Andrew, I know we focused on just one part of the story you tell, so I wonder, is there something more that you wish people better understood about Lord Dunmore and his famous proclamation?
When I was growing up in Virginia as a 10-year-old, I was told the story of the good guys and the bad guys. Dunmore was a bad guy and George Washington was a good guy. Now, I think that's an appropriate approach when somebody is 10, but this year we're going to be 250. So I think we're old enough now to be able to handle the truth. And the truth is that there were people on both sides who were fighting for liberty. And whatever color their coat, whether blue or red, is really not relevant. This country was founded on the idea of equality for all. And the Black men who were fighting for the British were fighting for exactly the same reasons that the Patriots were fighting. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to rethink it and really be able to praise those who were fighting for an ideal that we all can agree on, rather than simply somebody who was wearing one color coat.
Now it's time for our segment 1776 in Context. Now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the 250th anniversary of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, what do you think Dunmore's proclamation reveals about the American Revolution and its ideas about slavery, loyalties, and governance, and how those ideas took shape in the new emerging United States?
Well, it might be going a bit far to claim Lord Dunmore as a founding father, as a founder of our nation, but I think that we need to consider this possibility. In other words, while people like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and George Washington fully supported slavery and never really reconciled their call for liberty with the fact that they owned enslaved people, Lord Dunmore's proclamation, I think, lit the way. It allowed Americans to move slowly, tenuously, and then violently with the Civil War to a nation where slavery is outlawed and where people are all seen as the same under the law. this is such a fundamental piece of who we are. So I think we owe Dunmore, and more importantly, maybe these enslaved people who risked their lives in order to gain freedom. I think that this is the very best of America, and this is a great time to celebrate them.
Andrew, A Perfect Frenzy was your fourth book, and while this book is about the American Revolution in Virginia, you're mostly known for publications in science and archaeology. So are you working on a new history project, or are you working on something else?
That's a great question. I'm working on lots of different projects. It's kind of like dating, who do I want to commit myself to? But right now, I'm really enjoying getting out there and talking to people about A Perfect Frenzy and really trying to encourage people to challenge their old views of the revolution. Because what I uncovered, it seems so much more interesting and so much more richer and more alive than what I remember from the textbook. So I think this is just a great chance for me to get out and really talk and debate people about what happened and why the revolution started, why it ended the way it did, and what it means.
If we're interested in attending one of your book talks about A Perfect Frenzy, or if we have more questions about your work, where's the best place for us to find more information about you and these book talks?
You can go to andrewlawler.com. That's www.andrewlawler.com. And you can click on the tab that has my upcoming talks. I'll be traveling up and down the East Coast this fall. And also there's more information on my other books and my other magazine stories, etc. And you can also contact me on a form there at the website. Happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Andrew Lawler, thank you for joining us and for helping us better understand Lord Dunmore and the American Revolution in Virginia.
Thanks very much. It was a great pleasure.
Lord Dunmore's proclamation didn't just challenge the authority of Virginia's revolutionary government. It forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth: that enslaved people understood liberty and were willing to risk everything to achieve it. As Andrew revealed, Black Virginians didn't wait for freedom to be handed to them. They acted. They fled plantations, navigated treacherous terrain, and joined a cause that offered them hope, even as that hope came in the form of a red coat. And their willingness to fight for their freedom changed the dynamics of the revolution itself. Their actions pushed figures like George Washington to reconsider who could fight for independence and what that independence might mean once it was achieved. Dunmore's proclamation sparked both fear and transformation. It inspired Black resistance, disrupted plantation economies, and laid early groundwork for ideas about military service and citizenship, ideas that would echo in the American Civil War and beyond. Look for more information about Andrew, his book, A Perfect Frenzy, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/424. Did you enjoy today's episode? If so, please share it with a friend. After all, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, how do you think we should remember figures like Lord Dunmore? Men and women who may have been loyalists, but also unexpected revolutionaries. Let me know what you think. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com.